Hello, my name is Malcolm McNeill, and I'm the director of the SOAS Postgraduate Diploma in Asian Art. I'm here today to introduce you to a sample session from our online distance learning module, Asia's Art Histories. Asia's Art Histories is an immersive, thematic course that covers a broad range of topics across the various artistic and cultural traditions of Asia, and it's delivered in association with the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert Museum here in London. This lecture is entitled Chan Figure Painting in Transnational Contexts. It's delivered by myself, Dr. Malcolm McNeill, and it falls within our week on analysing visual cultures within Asia's art histories. If you'd like to find out more about Asia's art histories, we would love to hear from you. Please get in touch with me direct on mm133@soas.ac.uk. Alternatively, email our team, give us a call, or visit our website. Or if you want to find out more right now, please click on the link appearing on your screen for an introductory video to this programme.
Hello, and welcome to this lecture, Chan Figure Painting in Transnational Contexts, part of Asia's Art Histories Week on Analysing Visual Cultures. The learning outcomes for this lecture are as follows: to introduce debates over definitions of Chan and Zen Buddhist art and visual culture, to critically reflect on how visual evidence informs these definitions, to situate these debates in relation to a range of international collections, and to engage in visual and contextual analysis to inform your responses to these debates. These learning outcomes will be achieved in the following structure. We'll begin by looking at definitions, at Chan and Zen figure painting, and how we visualize that tradition, or how, perhaps more aptly, paintings and other forms of visual culture have given a physical and tangible visual manifestation to that tradition. We'll move on to talk about scattered sages, figures on the periphery of the pantheon, looking at how eccentrics can also serve as exemplars in this major vein of East Asian Buddhism. We'll conclude by looking at acquisition, alteration, and appropriation, considering the afterlives of Chan and Zen imagery in Central Asian and even Turkish contexts. The materials we'll study in this week's session encompass a broad range of collections across the world, from the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, to the National Museum in Tokyo, to the National Palace Museum in Taipei. We're looking at a broad range of perspectives and institutional contexts whose current geographic dispersal represents, or certainly indicates, the diversity of different perspectives, approaches, cultures, and contexts in which Chan and Zen imagery has been found over the past few centuries. Let's begin with our first topic, Chan and Zen figure painting, visualizing a tradition. But before we begin to look at tangible examples of what Chan and Zen figure painting might be, I want to start with a much more open-ended question for you. In a sense, getting a sense of where our preconceptions or perhaps even biases might be in how we approach this topic. So I want you to pause the recording for a second and take down some notes responding to the question, what does the term Zen art mean or evoke for you? Now, there are no right or wrong answers here. This is not intended for you to demonstrate an erudition and familiarity with this topic, but instead it's a reminder that this term in particular may carry very weighty or very well-formed associations with its kind of co-option into popular culture that may not be so immediately apparent for some of the other topics we cover within this week and upon this module. So take a few minutes to note down what this term Zen art means or evokes for you. Before we begin to look at tangible material or visual examples of Chan imagery, I wanted to begin by introducing you to some of the core concepts of Chan and Zen teachings. Now, Chan and Zen are respectively the Chinese and Japanese pronunciations for the name of this Buddhist school or lineage. They are a transliteration of the Sanskrit syllable dhyana, referring to meditative concentration. But the implications of what they come to mean in an East Asian context reaches far beyond this, and can perhaps be condensed around three core concepts included in Chan and Zen literature. These are, in a sense, claims to the uniqueness of Chan and Zen teachings, as expressed through the three following terms. First is the claim that Chan or Zen does not rely upon words, 不离文字, literally is not founded upon text. They also claim that awakening in this school of Buddhism is passed on through mind-to-mind transmission, a direct connection between master and disciple, 一心转心 in Chinese. And third, they claim to a separate transmission outside of the sutras, 教外别传. So all in all, this is a tradition that claims a distinctiveness, an otherness, if you will, with its authority coming from what we might today call an embodied authority in the person of senior clerics within the lineage of Chan and Zen, rather than through the inherited, appropriated, or manifest authority of the historical Buddha and his voice and his teachings through the sutras. So it's quite distinctive in this claim to be almost perpetually recreating the experience of enlightenment and the authority of the Buddha through the embodied person of the patriarchs in Chan and Zen's lineages. Now that does still trace its origins back to the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. And here we see the earliest extant earliest extant image, but not the earliest extant dated image of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni, seen in a particular Chan or Zen guise, emerging from the mountains. Here we find a depiction of him painted by Liang Kai in the late 12th or early 13th century, this work likely dated to the early 13th century, and produced expressly for the Southern Song court. You find that in Liang Kai's signature, appearing under the withered tree on the left-hand side here, which reads Yu Qian Tu Hua Liang Kai. So this is a reminder that in its 13th century manifestation in Southern Song China, Chan, or what would later be termed Zen, was an active kind of component of elite culture with imperial patronage supporting both its monasteries and its senior monastics who were directly appointed by the court, but also the creation of this distinctive Chan visual language in the production of images such as this that represent the Buddha at a particular point in his biography before he returns to the world from a period of ascetic reclusion and prior to his eventual awakening under the Bodhi tree. So that particular choice to situate the Buddha in this liminal moment in his biography is a distinctive feature of Chan, but nonetheless underscores for us that Chan still situates its authority as a direct lineal descent from the experience of awakening of the historical Buddha Shakyamuni. That lineage goes on to develop through its transmission from South Asia into East Asia, particularly China. And the key figure here is Bodhidharma, the Indian prince who in the 6th century of the Common Era, or 5th to 6th century, is purported to have traveled from South Asia to China, where he met with a number of senior rulers in that area, particularly Liang Wudi in the south. Now, Bodhidharma's teachings were misunderstood by this emperor, and in frustration, Bodhidharma then moved north, taking up a 9-year residency at the Shaolin Cave. Here we see him depicted by the 15th century Zen painter Sesshu Toyo, who depicts Bodhidharma at the end of his 9 years of seated meditation at the Shaoshi Cliff above Shaolin Monastery. Bodhidharma is the seated figure in the plain reserve white robe shown here. Often he's actually shown in a red robe. And his Indian or Indic origins are evident in his pronounced beard and facial hair, as well as his heavy brows and prominent nose. Contrast that with the standing figure of the monastic in the lower left, Huike Shengguang. Huike would go on to be Bodhidharma's first disciple in China and begin the transmission of Chan or Zen awakening in East Asia. Indeed, according to the hagiographies, Huike stood for several weeks in the snow before Bodhidharma even began with Bodhidharma refusing to even acknowledge him. And it was only by the severing of his own arm as an offering and a demonstration of his piety that Bodhidharma began to take Huike seriously, eventually taking him on as his disciple and leading to his eventual recognition as Bodhidharma's direct successor. And thus was founded the lineage of Chan or Zen in East Asia. And so here in this image, we see a hanging scroll painting depicting an interaction between these two figures, which captures this seminal moment in Chan history. As these lineages progress, they trace their origins from the kind of near mythic distant past into the contemporary experience of the successive dynastic periods of China, Japan, and Korea. And here we find a relatively early example, a 13th century portrait of Wu Zhun Shifan. Sorry, the dates do not appear on the slide here. Now in the collection of the Tofukuchi in Kyoto, and it served as an important foundational point for that monastery, as it was brought back from southern Song China, where the monastic Enyi Benin studied with Wu Zhun Shifan in his monastery, the Jingshan Monastery, around Westlake in Hangzhou. And so here we see the portrait of the master being brought from continental Asia, from China to Japan, as a demonstration of a continuity of lineage from, in this case, from a Chinese master to a Japanese disciple. And it marks for us the direct transition and transmission, if you will, of Chan teachings into their Zen inheritor or descendant, depending on how you choose to frame or explore it. Now, these lineages in both China and Japan were prominently displayed as part of what was called the Patriarch Hall in a Chan or Zen Buddhist monastery. We see an example of how the core images of that space would be displayed here, centered on a vertical axis at the middle. The figures are successively appearing with Bodhidharma in his red robe, just to the right of center here. And then the successive patriarchs appear in an alternate sequence on left, then right, then left, then right, then left, as we move through the succession of the lineage as it appears. And so in most monasteries, you would find the first 6 patriarchs of Chan or Zen Buddhism displayed in this kind of format, a formal seated portrait of the patriarch displayed in monastic robes, accompanied by an inscription by a senior monastic figure. Now, not all images produced to visualize the tradition of Chan or Zen were made as a kind of almost formalistic rendering of a portrait. We should also think about the ways in which Chan art, or art associated with the Chan school, manifested the ideas or ideals of that school, as we were hearing about a moment ago, the anti-textual, antinomian, and perhaps even kind of eccentric and outlandish claims that at times were associated with the senior figures of the Chan tradition. Certainly a general, at least rhetorical sentiment that Chan sat outside the norms of Buddhist monastic practice and was associated, at least in its historic origins, with radically distinctive forms of behavior that illustrated the profound awakening of its senior patriarchs. And that was particularly pronounced in these images purported to represent the 6th patriarch, Huineng, engaging in 2 acts. These are painted by Liang Kai, the same artist who produced the standing portrait of Shakyamuni emerging from the mountains we saw a moment ago. But here in his much more abbreviated or cursive technique known as the jianbi, or abbreviated brush. Now, these 2 works are both significant items in Japanese collections, registered as important cultural properties, formerly having been held in the collection of Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. On the left, we see the 6th patriarch chopping bamboo, and on the right, he is shown tearing up sutras, his index finger extended to supplant the role of the written word. Now, that pairing of almost menial labor with a kind of radical anti-textualism finds its corollary, if you will, in a common feature of Chan visual culture in a monastic context. And that is the trope of depictions of monks reading sutras by moonlight and mending clothes in the morning sun. Now, these 2 works, inscribed by Wu Zhuzi in the early Yuan dynasty in 1295, were formerly in the collection of the Tokugawa shogunate. They are, however, early Yuan dynasty paintings produced in continental Asia, in China, and they include for us that now quite familiar trope of the sitter in the lower register with the monastic inscription in the upper section, correlating to the way that the patriarchs were inscribed. But however, these are not biographies of named monastic individuals. These are generic type images, if you will, that underscore as a particular kind of motif or theme the claims to anti-textualism of the Chan tradition. In short, in these images, poems that accompany pictures of monks reading sutras by moonlight speak of the difficulty of obtaining, extracting, or attaining awakening or true understanding through the written word itself. You see in this painting, the monk holds the text, the scroll, close to his face on the left-hand side, his pin-like pupils squinting as he tries to extract a semblance of sense from this text. And many of these poetic inscriptions speak of the frustration of the monastic at their inability to extract truth, meaning, or awakening from the written word. And these are contrasted, these nocturnal acts of engagement with the canon, with the menial labor of mending clothes in the morning sun, a twice monthly routine activity for monastics in the Chan Vinaya, or monastic regulations. So the Chan Vinaya, the Qinggui, the pure rules of the Chan cloister, which were an augmentation of the transmitted Vinaya from the Buddhist sutras. So here in this image, we see the figure mending clothes in the morning sun, with the thread of the threaded needle, with the thread wrapped around their toe and clasped between their teeth. And as with the image on the left, where the frustrated reader holds the text close to their face, unable to extract meaning from it, this visual trope, often repeated, had a very pronounced and very particular symbolism. The moment of awakening is equated with the snap of the thread as the monk bites down upon the thread and completes the act of repairing and mending. And so that analogy of the immediacy, the suddenness of that breakage, the snapping of this cord, is equated to the breaking of illusions, and is correlated with this ideal of sudden awakening, or dunwu, in Chinese, through which Chan teachings often spoke of their senior monastic figures having attained awakening in moments of domestic and mundane labor, where a sound, a sensation, or often a physical blow to the body led to a transformative moment of awakening. So this here finds a recurrent part of everyday monastic life, a routine that all Chan monastics would take part in, and equates it with a route to transformative Buddhist awakening. So let's come back then to Liang Kai's diptych of the sixth patriarch tearing up sutras and chopping bamboo. And so here we find an almost exaggerated version of that juxtaposition of the surmounting of text, or the refuting of the efficacy of text, and instead the display of the efficacy or importance of manual labor. Here the sixth patriarch stands with his finger outstretched, his mouth open, his voice, his speech act, supplanting the torn pages of this text, which by tradition is read to be a Buddhist sutra, which falls onto the ground plane below. He walks towards the putative viewer, crossing the ground plane here, and a kind of frenetic energy to the strokes that render his robe, as well as an authority, a kind of disheveled authority nonetheless, in his antinomian, unconventional behavior. As a monk, one would expect him to shave his head and keep adherence to the regulations of the Vinaya. But here we see him with an extended hairdo and a kind of almost wild and unpredictable set of behaviors, a trope that we will come back to shortly when we think about the scattered sages, or Sansheng, as a group within the Chan pantheon. So here the patriarch stands as a kind of binary figure. On one point, a religious authority within the Chan lineage and tradition, but on another, a figure who is refuting established sources of authority and replacing them with the embodied presence of Chan's own lineage, expressed here through his act of speech. Here we find the parallel to that. Instead of the overt supplementation of the written word or replacement of the written word with Chan eccentric behaviors of senior monastics. Instead, we see here the figure enwrapped and ensconced, if you will, embedded, if you will, in this act of manual labor. The shaft of the bamboo tilted at an angle, the blade of this machete-like knife held aloft, ready for a severing blow to cut obliquely into the integer between the stem of the bamboo, and to lead to a break of this this regular kind of piece of well, if not firewood, then the bamboo is a kind of a regular material used in a number of kind of domestic practices in Song Dynasty China, from the kind of construction of fences to anyway, a useful material. And Huineng, the sixth patriarch, was purported to have been a woodcutter, and prior to his eventual ordination and subsequent recognition as the sixth patriarch of the Chan lineage. So here this is somewhat ambiguous, reflecting perhaps his origins as a manual laborer, but certainly displaying for us a kind of iconic rendering of that that physical activity, that immediacy of bodily presence, which we can equate, at least obliquely, with the trope of the mending clothes in the morning sun. Now, those images that we've looked at so far all date from the 13th century in China, in the southern Song. They come from a largely kind of shared region in the lower Yangtze Delta, around between Hangzhou and Ningbo in modern-day China. But this trope, this treatment of these subjects, was certainly not limited to that area of China. As I've said, we should think about Chan and Zen as a continental tradition, which, while it evolves and changes in its Japanese transmission, does nonetheless share a number of common features with, Zen shares a number of common features with its Chinese predecessor in Chan. So here we have a painting by the artist Kano Tanyu of the Kano school, who've specialized particularly in the close study and at some points direct replication of continental or Chinese models within painting and calligraphy, particularly painting. And here we see the reproduction of that composition from Liang Kai in Kano Tanyu's brush in the 17th century, with an inscription likely datable to around 1635 to 1645. And it comes, and the inscription comes from Takuan Soho, a senior abbot in the Zen Linji lineage. The inscription reads as follows: "One strike of a knife vanquishes all thoughts, green jade of bamboo scattered over the earth, mountains and rivers." Now, this excerpt from the inscription makes clear to us that the abbot in the 17th century inscription in Japan is making explicit what is perhaps not quite so clearly and expressly defined in the earlier Chan image. Here we have a kind of an appropriation, or a reimagining, if you will, of Liang Kai's composition, with an added extended inscription with very different proportions, format, and context. A kind of definitiveness in its interpretation added over what might have simply been implied or inferred from Liang Kai's original image. There is a concreteness to the way in which this image means to us as a viewer through the express intercession of Takuan Soho's inscription. And here we see the two images alongside, sharing a great deal in terms of their overarching content, the position of the figure largely analogous, the choice of subject clearly aligned, and the direct relationship between the paintings somewhat unambiguous, as Kano Tanyu would have had direct access to this painting as part of his access to elite collections in Japan at that time. So we can think of this as a freehand loose copy of Liang Kai's composition. But technically, it's remarkably different in a number of senses. The emphasis on line and a strong sense of bodily weight and presence in the image on right, contrasted on the emphasis on wash and expressivity in the image on the left. So they're not entirely, while they share iconographic features, their stylistic or technical execution is markedly different, as well as the impact of that composition. So I want to conclude this section with an initial activity for you to engage in. So in a moment, I'd encourage you, once you've had the prompt, to pause the recording and spend around 5 minutes either taking notes on this, and even better, responding to this prompt within the discussion forum for this week. Now, the activity in question, the prompt for you, is to ask to what extent these works by Liang Kai and Kano Tanyu are part of a common visual culture. In a sense, to what extent are they can we think of Chan and Zen imagery as a shared tradition, a common tradition? And I don't think there is a simple or easy answer to this. I have my view on it, which I've published in an article in the Transactions of the Oriental Ceramic Society. But what I want to hear is what you think about this. How do you see their relationship? How would you characterize it? And you may wish to consider iconography. You might wish to think about materials and techniques that are used by the artists, and indeed, I say artists in the plural within the singular work by Takuan Soho and Kano Tanyu. Or you might want to think about particularly the importance of the presence or absence of this calligraphic inscription. So to what extent are these works by Liang Kai and Kano Tanyu part of a common visual culture? And if so, what is that common visual culture? I'll leave that prompt with you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the discussion forum for this week. Now, having outlined some of the core features of Chan and/or Zen imagery, how it's treated and used in monastic contexts, and how this visual tradition correlates or interacts with some of the core teachings of Chan and Zen, I wanted to come on to focus on a particular subset within Chan figural imagery, the depiction of scattered sages, figures on the periphery of the Chan pantheon. Now, this grouping, the Sansheng, are an explicit kind of subset, if you will, of Chan hagiographies. These hagiographies were recorded from as early as the beginning of the 11th century in texts such as the Jingde era record of the transmission of the lamp that recorded particular groupings within lineages of Chan patriarchs and masters, but had a subsection for those figures who sat outside of the conventional canon, if you will. These were often, in their biographies, liminal or marginal figures who lived on the outskirts of monastic life, sometimes on an itinerant existence between monasteries, but nonetheless whose presence or whose treatment in these biographies was often treated as the concealed presence of a fully awakened being, such as a bodhisattva or even a Buddha. So I want to begin with two examples of this coming from around the same period as many of the works we've looked at so far, these 13th century depictions of the monk Budai on the left and the monk Fenggan on the right. Now, both of these figures were purported to have lived during the Tang dynasty between which ran 618 to 907 of the Common Era. Budai lived towards the end of that period and Fenggan towards the middle of that period. And here they are paired by the same artist, Li Jue, and both are inscribed by the senior Chan abbot, Yanxi Guangwen, whose portrait, in fact, no, it was Wu Jun Shifan's portrait we saw earlier, excuse me. So they're both inscribed by a senior Chan abbot from Westlake. So we're looking at the visual culture of an environment that we've spent a bit of time in already. You'll notice some features are shared between these images and the other works that we've touched on so far. The long and shaggy hair rather than the neatly shaven head. But there are some new features that we find, particular attributes of these eccentrics that characterize them and adds to their mystique and indeed their otherness. The large sort of engorged sack held in Budai's hand while he looks upward laughing with his hand clasped over his corpulent belly. And more strikingly, perhaps, in the image on the right, we see Fenggan, whose name literally means big stick, his titular staff rising above him as his shoulders are hunched, his nostrils flared, and his mouth downturned. But most striking of all is the tiger who accompanies him. It's this prominent feline, its tail erect, mirroring the structure of his staff, and its hair bristling in a kind of gesture of aggression and hostility. Now, Fenggan was purported to be accompanied wherever he went by this, if not tame, but certainly kind of tiger that was tame to him. And it speaks to the kind of the control of wild and bestial forces that ties in with that liminal power exerted by the scattered sages or Sansheng within the Chan pantheon. But let's look in a bit more detail as to how the inscription by Yanxi Guangwen, this senior Chan abbot, interacted with this image. So we've touched on the painting already, but the inscription above it reads as follows: "Only explaining how to grasp the tiger's head, not explaining how to grab the tiger's tail. Befuddling old Lu Qiu, the guilty party was you, Yanxi Guangwen of Jingshan." So here, the kind of that mastery of a bestial nature, which was inaccessible and not fully explained by the conduct and deportment, and indeed the kind of recorded behavior of Fenggan is being dealt with by Guangwen, but also being spoken of in a kind of colloquial, almost playful manner. This kind of the guilty party was you, the trickster nature befuddling this figure, Lu Qiu, a historic figure also from the Tang dynasty, whose identity is a bit ambiguous, but Helmut Brinker associates perhaps with a Confucian associate of Fenggan, a near contemporary of his. So here we're looking at a figure portrayed as something of a trickster, but whose mastery of his spiritual prowess, if you will, was not fully transmitted or understood by subsequent generations. And that bestial mastery comes across very much in the way that Fenggan is depicted here. This sense that his understanding of the wild animal, which perhaps stands here as the analog to the untamed ego of the Chan or Zen practitioner, is represented by the ferocious, powerful beast that we see here. This is not a tamed, wild animal which has been subdued by the equanimity of the Chan practitioner. Instead, the wildness, the bestial ferocity of the animal is embodied in the monk as well. Multiple elements of the imagery mirroring the identity of the feline and the human, a kind of zoomorphic rather than anthropomorphic rendering of the subject. Whether it's in the flared nostril, the downturned mouth, the set of the shoulders, or indeed that kind of direct parallel between the staff and the tail, show a kind of equivalence between the senior monk and his ferocious familiar. Now, the image of Budai depicts a slightly different tone, but with a similar kind of message. The inscription on Budai has a similar tone, but a slightly different tone, but a similar message. It reads as follows: floating, floating travels, wave and wave of walking, coming and going all over, how many taints or how many stains, before the jade pavilion, after Sudana has gone, in this place of green, green grass, will you still be known? The verse does not lend itself to easy or ready resolution, and there are, as with many of these Chan poems, multiple layers of allusion being undertaken here to particular sutras, canonical events, and it particularly that reference to Sudana, potentially an allusion to the Hua Yan Jing, or the kind of esoteric texts that were circulating in the Song period at the time that spoke of different routes to awakening and enlightenment. So there's a kind of layering of reference that we don't really have time, or it's not quite appropriate for our topic to unpack here, but it can be clearly stated that Yanxi Guangwen is portraying this subject as an itinerant, inaccessible, and but fundamentally awakened figure whose identity is concealed from us during his own lifetime. That notion of whether he will still be known, concluding the poem. And indeed, many versions of Budai's biography present him as an incarnation of the future Buddha Maitreya, as something that he reveals on his deathbed in his biography in many of the versions circulating around the time in which this painting was inscribed. When we look to the image itself, however, we see a slightly different emphasis. The emphasis is not on the unknowable quality of the character and his vagrant and vagabond lifestyle. Those are perhaps alluded to in his bare feet and the engorged sack that he holds. But there is a kind of perhaps a more human characterization of him, a mood or sentiment that is contained here in the belly-rocking laugh of the subject, his hand clasped across his chest and his head turned upward, staring at something beyond our knowledge, outside of the picture frame, that brings to him great amusement and delight. Again, all captured within the context of a relaxed, almost kind of disheveled deportment of the monastic figure. Identifiably a monk through his clothing, but nonetheless he is barefoot, long-haired and bare-chested. So this antinomian or wild and unconventional behavior comes across quite clearly. We find many other figures within the scattered sages grouping, particularly the two monks Hanshan and Shide, literally Cold Mountain and Foundling. And they're shown here paired in an image from the early 13th or late 13th or early 14th century, attributed to the professional painter Yan Hui, as an indicator that not all the images of these Chan eccentrics were produced within the context of monastic spaces implied by the inscriptions by Yanxi Guangwen. They were also produced for kind of more popular veneration and in more kind of animated, less perhaps scholarly or esoteric styles, as the monochrome ink paintings we've been looking at a moment ago. But these two figures, bear in mind, were closely associated with Fenggan. Indeed, they were brought into their home monastery by Fenggan, and Hanshan living in the mountains nearby, and Shile serving in the kitchen in the Tianqing monastery. So they work with Fenggan almost as a trinity, and are in fact revealed to be the bodhisattvas Manjusri and Samantabhadra, when Fenggan eventually reveals himself to be an incarnation of the Buddha Amitabha. Now, other depictions of these Chan eccentrics circulated in different formats. Thus far, I've wanted to the works we've looked at have all been presented in a hanging scroll vertical format, where the painting is produced as a kind of simulated presence in an almost portrait-like rendering with occasionally calligraphic inscriptions. Here in this work by Yin Tuoluo, inscribed by Chu Shifangqi from the mid-14th century, captures for us a different kind of format in which Chan interactions or figures were shown. The calligraphy is in the semi-cursive script popularized by the court, the scholar, calligrapher, and sometime court servitor of Kublai Khan, Zhao Mengfu, really a preeminent figure in the formation of Yuan scholar aesthetics, who reinvigorated the semi-cursive calligraphy of the 4th century of Wang Xizhi and brought that into play. So in essence, this is a kind of a scholarly, somewhat courtly style of calligraphy, an elite form of writing, if you will, that is being conspicuously performed by the Chan monk here, Chu Shifangqi, in the inscription that accompanies the image. The image on the left, however, is painted by Yin Tuoluo, who is recorded in Japanese sources as a monk of Indian origin, potentially a Central Asian. But it has been commented, as we'll look in more detail in a moment, that the painting style for this artist is subtly but importantly different from many of the features of the works that we've seen so far. A reminder that the artist creating Chan visual cultures may not necessarily be constrained solely to the kind of the cultural traditions of China and Japan as we imagine them. But the other thing I wanted you to bear in mind is the format of this work, that it reads from right to left, or at least once upon a time it did. It was originally produced in a hand scroll format, which has since been cut and remounted as a hanging scroll for display in the Tokonoma alcove as part of this tea ceremony in Japan. Today, it is a national treasure of Japan, in no small part on account of the exceptional calligraphy upon it, and it is housed in the Netsu Institute of Fine Arts. The inscription upon it reads as follows: "Though through sleazy streets and bustling market he passes indifferently, he invokes and becomes Maitreya, then he becomes Mara, the demon revealing an eye on his back, almost startling to death Jiang Mo He, who scrubs Budai's back." And as I said, the inscription here is very much an erudite performance of elite calligraphy of the day. When we going back for a second, when we look at the overarching image, we see here the subject being illustrated. Budai is clearly the bald-headed, smiling figure whose kind of reckless abandon and laughter again characterizes him on the left-hand side of the image. His large titular sack appears here, and here is Jiang Mo He, the figure who appears in some versions of Budai's biography, and in some accounts is requested by Budai to scrub his back when he bathes in a river, being startled to discover 4 human eyes staring at him from the figure's back. These kind of strange, quizzical, to some extent not fully explained manifestations of the divinity and otherness, treated here as the almost demonic quality of Budai in Chu Shifangqi's inscription. He invokes and becomes Maitreya, then he becomes Mara, this kind of challenging of the dichotomy of the awakened and the profane, or the distraction. So he sort of sits outside the constraints of where we might normally understand, of what our limited understanding is of the experience of the awakened. Now this scene, I want to link to a slightly different version of the same sort of stylistic grouping, if you will, these monochrome ink paintings so closely associated with the Chan tradition in the 14th century. The image on the left, as I said, is by Yin To-lo, this putatively Indian figure who, in some estimations, particularly the writing of Yoshiaki Shimizu, is credited with holding a much more staid and consistent approach to line work. Look particularly at the outline of the figure's shoulder on the right here and on the left, a kind of consistent unmodulated rendering of the outline of the drapery, and indeed the structure of the figure's face, which Yoshiaki Shimizu argues equates to or potentially equates to the use of a stylus rather than a flexible animal hair brush. So again, an indication that at least in some areas, Chan visual culture of the 14th century is being impacted by the movement of peoples across the Trans-Eurasian Mongol Empire. However, in my view, there are a few indicators that kind of pay to that theory. There are perhaps some indicators that Yin To-lo has a fluency beyond the animal hairbrush, but we do nonetheless see modulation and difference within the thickness and thinning of the strokes for the darker accents upon the figure's robes, and indeed on the dry, coarse brushwork of the tree upon which the figure leans. However, there is a marked difference in the degree of modulation and the expressed confidence and control when we contrast this image by Yin To-lo with the image on the right-hand side here. The image on the right is by a Japanese pilgrim monk, Mokuan Reian, who spent around 20 years in China from the 1320s through to 1345, a period in which was not an uncommon length of time for a Japanese pilgrim monk to spend in China in that period. But what was perhaps exceptional about Mokuan Reian is the large legacy of paintings that he leaves for us, capturing a number of Chan or Zen subjects, which were subsequently brought back to Japan. Indeed, Mokuan's presence in China led him for a prolonged period, and the acquisition of his works from Chinese sources led for a long period for him to be treated as a Chinese painter in the Japanese historical literature, up until the modern period. So when we look at this image here, we can see a far greater degree of modulation and confidence, a thickening and thinning of the line of the outline of these figures' robes and drapery, a sense of volume and presence, and perhaps more eloquence, if you will, in the way in which the outlines of the robes are executed, contrasted with the still relatively consistent, but nonetheless engaging outlines that characterize Fan Yin To-lo's work on the left. But let's turn back to this image and the subject which it depicts for us. It's a very popular subject in Chan literature, Chan imagery, I should say, not literature, known as the Four Sleepers. It shows Fenggan and his tiger, alongside his companions Hanshan and Shide, asleep in a kind of cumulative pile of awakened eccentric beings, all of them dreaming their dreams with their consciousness deliberately and conspicuously removed from our own. Here we see them in a wild and exposed space, potentially next to the titular cold cliff by which Hanshan lived, but living in the wilds around the Tianqing monastery, near where they were purported to have lived in the hagiographies. This is inscribed by a figure known as Xiaomi, who's otherwise unidentified, but likely a senior Chan monastic figure who remains to be identified. We can also compare this to other images that depict this sort of liminal state of sleep in the trope of the slumbering Budai that we find here in a work formerly attributed to the monk painter Mu Xifachang, which is otherwise unsigned, now in the collection of the Kyoto National Museum. So coming back to Mokuan Reian's painting, we find in the inscription something that gives us a sense of how this scene might have been read by its contemporary viewers. The inscription reads, "Old Fenggan embraces his tiger and sleeps, all huddled together with Shide and Hanshan. They dream their big dream, which lingers on, while a frail old tree clings to the bottom of the cold precipice." The calligraphy is in a stark angular hand with in fact, a slightly rounded tip, but nonetheless a kind of prominent kind of thinness to the strokes, adding a sort of expressivity, but in a readily legible regular script. When we look at that alongside the overall image, the inscription does not dominate the composition in perhaps the same ways we have seen already. Think back to those images of Budai and Fenggan inscribed by Yanxi Guangwan, where a prominent area of the blank support was left in the upper register of the scroll. Here, instead, we see the inscription inserted alongside landscape elements that give us a stronger sense of specificity and context, perhaps even a direct allusion to that frail old tree clinging to the bottom of the cold precipice, within which Fungan, Shida, Hanshan, and Fungan's tiger lie in a sleeping huddle. There are certainly features that kind of correlate Fungan and Budai in this image, the exposed corpulent belly, the long and unkempt hair, all of this coming together within the image. But certainly through the poetry, as well as the iconography, there is a sense to see these figures as liminal transitory figures whose awakened experiences beyond our knowledge, beyond our access, but who nonetheless serve as inspirational sort of narrative figures within the Chan tradition. A kind of misunderstood or little understood eccentric who was on the periphery of the pantheon, but no less powerful and efficacious for that peripheral status. Now, I have an activity I'd like you to engage in at this stage to consolidate what we've just been looking at and to reflect on it. My prompt for you is to consider the relative position of these images of eccentrics, exemplified by the painting by Moko and Rean that we see on the right, with the images of the more conventional portrait-like paintings that we discussed earlier in the image of Wu Jun Shifan on the left. So please take a few minutes to compare and contrast these two images of senior figures from the Chan lineage or pantheon. What do they share? How do they differ? And you may wish to consider the material, the format, the iconography, and the techniques used within their execution. So I hope you found this exercise productive, and I look forward to discussing it further with you in the seminar. But what you may have identified or focused on here is the commonality of the fact that both are mediated by monastic inscription, the fact that they are centered still on prominent depictions of figural subjects rather than choosing to depict landscape. But the seniority of these figures is quite distinctive. One is there in a formalized, accessible, defined role of seniority within a monastic complex, emulating their role in life in the senior seat within the monastic compound, whereas the image on the right shows antinomian figures in a wild space, inaccessible and almost threatening through their bestial familiar. Materially, the image on the left, to simulate the presence of the patriarch, draws on rich materiality of a highly realistic form of portraiture, using ink, color, and gold pigments together to create a realistic rendering simulating the presence of the past patriarch. Both are in a vertical format hanging scroll, enabling them to be displayed in a seasonal context and to be engaged with as a complete visual experience. And the iconography is to some extent quite different between them. The emphasis on the trappings of monastic authority clearly and expressly displayed in the figure on the left, whereas in the image on the right, there is a kind of loose borrowing of poetic allusion, less clearly defined and less expressly legible to us, where in the image of Wu Jun Shifan, we see so clearly that his status and senior status in that prominent clasp that holds his robe together, the stick of his monastic authority used to strike disciples into a state of wakefulness, the prominent black lacquered chair, every element of the textiles that clothe him and that drape the chair upon which he seats, underscore his both temporal and, more importantly, his associated religious authority. Whereas in the image on the left, the iconography, the content of the image, really celebrates and emphasizes the wild remove in which the figures are seated. And technically, these are remarkably different approaches. One, a hyper-realistic courtly style, almost courtly style, that approaches a kind of high degree of verisimilitude, a close likeness of the sitter as seen by the naked eye in life, contrasted with the perhaps more expressive and certainly more imaginative rendering of the group on the right. I want to move on now to our final section, talking about the acquisition, alteration, and appropriation of Chan imagery, indeed the afterlives of Chan and Zen imagery in Central Asian contexts. And here, I essentially pose for you a question. To what extent should this image that we see before us be thought of as a Chan or Zen painting? How far does this interact or correlate with what we've been looking at so far? And we may think about this in terms of iconography, in terms of reception, in terms of material or technique, and in terms of the intention of the artist who made it. And it is signed Siak Kalam in the lower left, the black pen, It's datable to the 15th century, and it's currently in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was formerly in a prominent folio compiled or produced in the Timurid period of the 15th century in Central Asia. And it depicts for us figures that are closely iconographically associated with some of the images we've been looking at so far. We have two figures in it with conspiratorial grins leaning in toward one another. One of them carries what looks like a large bag in their left hand. Their left hand, the figure on the left here. So we can see if we follow from the hand, the strings, the cords attached to it going down to this large sack hanging down here. The figures are barefoot. They wear loosely fitting robes, and one of them has an exposed chest with a rosary strung around his neck. His mouth is wide open, his tongue raised almost in laughter, and they lean in toward one another with their slightly exaggerated faces. The tail of this feline creature that accompanies the standing figure on the right is erect, mirroring the structure of his staff. But the creature that walks alongside him is almost docile. Its paws raised and comfortable to be petted by the presumably perhaps Buddhist figure that we see here. He certainly looks like a Buddhist monk to us. And there are clearly parallels between Budai and Fungan, as we discussed a moment ago. But to what extent should we think of them in that sense? The Metropolitan Museum of Art catalogues this work as a depiction of two luohan. I have another time in a different publication argued they should be described as two Chinese Buddhist wanderers with a tame tiger. But there are perhaps even more explicit ways they could be framed within a Central Asian context, associating them with dervishes or liminal figures within the Central Asian or Timurid tradition in which the image was produced. Now, to give a bit of context to the time and place in which this image was made and what kinds of interactions were occurring between Ming China and the Timurid Empire in Central Asia, we should perhaps start with this image. So the early part of the 15th century was characterized perhaps most significantly by the moving of the Ming capital from Nanjing in the south to Beijing in the north. We could devote a whole lecture to that and a lengthy discussion on it, but here it serves as a backdrop to our story of the transmission of a Chan or Zen image type to a Central Asian context. It's a reminder that the event of this move of the capital was something that undertaken by the Yongle Emperor and completed in 1421, was attended by a large number of delegations and travelers, visitors from Central Asia, and indeed across the neighboring states around the Ming Empire, and was part of one of the many catalysts or prompts for extended diplomatic interaction in that period. Indeed, one possible conduit through which this Chinese Buddhist imagery found its way into Central Asia and into the hands of a Central Asian draftsman, or the studio of a Central Asian draftsman, was through the diplomatic exchanges and the material culture that moved with people along these various routes. And indeed, the account from 1419 to 1422 of the Timurid embassy to Ming Beijing, who attended the kind of formal declaration of the new capital in 1421, reads as follows: "The figures of the bakshis of the size of a man were so vividly reproduced that one would think the unbelievers were really alive. Over the rest of the walls there were paintings of such character that all painters in the world would be struck with wonder." And this is an excerpt from the historian Hafez-i Abru, giving an account of the experience of the 1419 to 1422 Timurid embassy to Ming Beijing, which was one of several tens of visits that took place in the first half of the 15th century between the Timurid Empire and the Ming. But it contains in this written account a quite vivid sense of admiration and awe, if you will, and certainly interest in the iconography of what I presume to be either Buddhist or Taoist images produced in this context, perhaps not dissimilar from the kinds of image prototypes that were later adapted to this Timurid drawing. Now, what then could we see as the prototypes that are coming together here? There is, of course, that explicit parallel in the figure on the right with Fungan, discussed earlier. The equivalence between the staff and the tiger's tail mirrored once again. And while I'm certainly not asserting that Li Que's image of Fungan and his tiger was by any means the direct prototype for this, it's indicative of the existence of a kind of image that might have been available through a more vernacular form to the Timurid artist who went on to produce this image. The image on the left, by contrast, shows a more general and conventionalized depiction of how Buddhist subjects might treat the kind of subduing of the ego through the rendering of a feline or tiger subject. When we look closely, we see a closer correlation. The Lohan Badoloa Badra with his tiger in a depiction by the Ming painter Dai Jin, in a very realistic and animated composition. You see the Buddhist figure's hand outstretched, almost petting the tiger's neck, as we also see in the detail of the drawing by Sikh Kalim. Now, interestingly, the image on the right, when we look closely, we can see a few stripes across the forehead, but nothing that clearly defines this creature, even as a tiger. It may be kind of amalgamated, in a sense, with the Central Asian, more conventional Central Asian depictions of lions. But nonetheless, it's a potentially ferocious feline, its hooked teeth within its jaw, its wide padded feet, and the potential strength of its shoulders, subdued and mastered, if you will, by this eccentric being, this eccentric person who stands to the right of the composition. And it's certainly a far cry from the zoomorphic bestiality of Fenggan as depicted by Li Jue. When we look at the image on the left, we find a number of iconographic features that create direct parallels with the monk Budai. Conspicuously, the raised tongue in a gesture of laughter in this very famous version of images of Budai, now in the Kyushu National Museum, attributed to Mushi Fatran, which became something of an archetypal representation of the subject in Japan from the 14th through to the 17th centuries. Here we see the close correlation in the kind of pinprick pupil of the subject, the positioning of the teeth, and indeed that almost triangular composition of the raised tongue indicating laughter. The exposed chest and belly correlating also with the image by Li Jue, although interestingly here, the figure has a shaven head. We could perhaps stop there, having found safely a number of iconographic prototypes that connect these two subjects with Chan or Zen precedents, and attribute them as a genre or as a type to depictions of Chan eccentrics in a Central Asian context by Sikh Kalim. However, I think we need to think very much about how this image, this preparatory drawing, might have been used in a more finished work by the artist, or within the context of Central Asian and Timurid visual culture of the Persianate world. If we talk about them as Chan figures or Zen figures, we're situating them iconographically in relation to their iconographic antecedents in China, or perhaps their parallels in Japan. But we're not really thinking about how this kind of image was used or circulated in Central Asia in this time. And so with that in mind, I want to move on to look at how a similar figure appears in a near contemporary, more fully realized miniature painting from the Timurid period. This work here is executed with a reed pen with subtle application of color on paper. It sits quite distinctively and technically from the Chan figure paintings we were looking at a moment ago, and is clearly used as a preparatory drawing as a kind of reservoir, a kind of type form, if you will, that the artist could deploy in more finished works. And here is an example of just such a work. A scene from the text Sheikh Maneh and the Villager, executed in opaque watercolor, silver and gold on paper. And it comes from folio 49 of the Language of the Birds, a manuscript datable to 1487, or a folio of images and text datable to 1487, based on the 11th to 12th century, mid-12th to early 13th century poem by Fayir al-Din Attar. Excuse my pronunciation. Now, this finished work is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as is the image of the two Buddhist wanderers, or two Lohan, that we were looking at a moment ago. While the image itself, the focal sense is on the allegory of the action of the cowherd in the lower section here, and these figures gathered around the campfire in the upper section, I want to draw your attention to a figure who does not feature in the text at all, but provides perhaps a kind of a marginal illustration of a liminal figure in a Central Asian context who we see under this tree that beautifully breaks out from the boundaries of the composition. As we look more closely, we find here a figure with an extended staff with a dragon-like head upon it. If we go back a few slides, we can see that indeed here the staff of the Lohan has a dragon-like head. So here there is a dragon-like head atop this curved staff of the figure. He wears an earring, eccentric kind of addition to his body that we find in figures of some Chan eccentrics. We find his robe open and exposed. He has an animal familiar with him, although in this case a hound rather than a tiger. And there's also a textile of some kind with intriguing these swastika motifs, a Buddhist symbol of eternity found upon them. But the figure is so close to the depiction of Budai as to be almost arresting, particularly when we look at it alongside the potential mediation of a drawing like this one. The sitter in the image, the finished image on the left, is clearly understood by the Timurid viewer of the manuscript as representing a dervish, a kind of another form of liminal and eccentric figure within a very different tradition, but nonetheless seems to have been mediated through the transmission of Chan or Zen iconography via these, most likely via these Timurid interactions with Ming Beijing in the 15th century, or with the Ming polity in the 15th century, that led to the influx or adoption and subsequent adaptation and appropriation of Chan iconography to this Central Asian context. And indeed, we find even more closely, perhaps, that image of Budai with his staff slumbering here in that painting we saw earlier from the Kyoto National Museum, equating with the sleeping state of the figure here. And that trope of sleep, of slumber, of a liminal state is underscored even further when we move on to look at a selection of images from the Bahram Mirza album, compiled by Das Muhammad in the 16th century during the Safavid period. So the images that were collated are datable to the 15th century in many cases. And here we find what many have termed a vernacular Ming painting of the three eccentrics, Fenggan, Hanshan, and Shida, here examining a scroll with this sleeping dog and these two mice within it in a landscape scene. We see Shida's broom along the base of the scene, and we find Fenggan kind of enveloping them within this medallion-like structure. Now, when we look at the image, overall, you may notice that actually this is a composite image, a collage of multiple paintings that have been cut, pasted, and stuck together again with this equestrian drawing in the upper left, the coloration added to this leafless tree in the center, and another element of landscape here with this small bird in the lower right-hand corner. So it's a composite image where the central medallion-like structure is used to insert these eccentric foreign figures within this creative reconstruction put together in the mid-16th century as part of Safavid court art, the art of the book, in which this was one of a number of images within the overall folio. And it perhaps could be left there and read as a kind of eccentric inclusion of a foreign oddity that is owned and recorded and looked at, kind of resituated playfully, but perhaps not with great meaning. Something that is simply to be looked at as something exterior to the visual traditions of the Persian world in which this album is situated. However, while in this case, the image is an appropriation, a kind of physical repurposing, if you will, of a Ming painting into a Safavid album, when we look at another work, which we see on the right-hand side here, we find a very different take on that same subject. The image on the right here comes from the same album and shows a different way in which these images of eccentrics were adapted and redeployed in a Timurid context. This is a depiction of the Four Sleepers. The subject is not directly named in the inscription that accompanies it. However, iconographically, it is documented and read as such in almost all scholarly literature on the subject. And the medallion-like structure of these three figures, and indeed the four figures when we count the tiger, are so clearly displayed for us as to be immediately identifiable as a connection with that potential prototype in the Ming image that was redeployed here within the same album. However, here we're looking at a work produced by a 15th century Timurid hand to adapt that motif into an indigenous form of art production. And so the exact meaning of this remains something ambiguous for us. It's certainly a creative response to a foreign substrate, a foreign inspiration, if you will. But it also, and it's clearly adapting the visual styles There is an emphasis on drapery and line work that we find here, but the focus on color and the technical motifs are all very much indicative of the artistic tradition of Timurid Central Asia in which it is produced, appropriating and adapting the substrate, if you will, of the Chan imagery being acted upon by the catalyst of Persianate creativity. However, when we look at the kind of correlations to this, there is perhaps a bit more to that, the explicit paralleling of this liminal state of sleep that was connected to the awakened status of these three figures and their feline companion, represented here by Mokwa Nrian's Four Sleepers composition, but here kind of repositioned in the tighter oval composition that we see on the right, sits in kind of quite a close parallel with the narrative of the Persianate world of the seven sleepers, seven sagely figures who undertook a protracted period of slumber in a cave, hidden away for centuries, and their sagely status, their venerable status as prophets of the Persianate tradition, widely celebrated in art and literature, providing a direct corollary, if you will, for this narrative trope or this perhaps more general motif that we find in the image of the four sleepers of Fenggan, Hanshan, and Shuda. However, the iconography in the image on the left is clearly changed here. The broom no longer visible, the identifying features to some extent dropped, and instead focusing upon the integration of these figural groupings. So as a final activity, I'd encourage you to reflect on that core concept we've been exploring today, the definition and delineation of a genre or type of imagery within visual arts and culture, visual art and visual culture. And I want to ask you in the remaining few minutes of this session to pause the recording for around perhaps 5 minutes or so and respond in your notes or the discussion forum to the following question. Does the category of Chan or Zen art help or hinder your understanding of these images? How else might you choose to categorize or position them art historically? So really, to what extent does an understanding, knowledge, and engagement with Chan or Zen visual culture help or hinder your understanding of these images? Does the firmness of that grouping, that kind of assertion of the presence of Chan and Zen as an artistic or art historical type really help you to identify what we're looking at here? Or does it actually hinder you in acknowledging the agency of Timurid artists, Safavid compilers, and eventually the Turkish Ottoman owners of this album who would appreciate, enjoy, and engage with it in different and creative manners of reinterpretation and remounting? So to what extent does this category help? To what extent does it hinder? And how else might you choose to position, categorize, or indeed analyze these subjects? Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to discussing this topic further with you in the weekly seminar. Goodbye.